We are live again. Thanks for watching last time, if you did. And if this is your first time, I'm Tim Wendelboe, and I run the company Tim Wendelboe, based in Oslo, Norway. So if you're into coffee, you might be tuning in. If you're not, then this is going to be a session where we talk about coffee roasting. So if you have any questions about coffee roasting in particular, I will try to answer as much as I can. I have to say though, don't really know much about coffee roasting. I don't really know much about the theory behind it, the chemistry behind it, although I've been trying to read as much as I can for the last 20 years. It's been really difficult to kind of get an overview of everything. We know some processes happening, but I know that it's very, very difficult to research coffee roasting because a lot of the processes happening inside the coffee bean is happening very, very quickly and while the temperature is going up. So if you stall the roast, meaning you take the beans out, those processes might stop, and it's very, very difficult to research what actually happens. So if you're interested in how green coffee turns brown, now is the time to ask me any questions. I know we are quite famous for roasting very light, but it's not a matter of being too light or as light as possible. For me, it's a matter of getting the coffees developed and sweet, and so that they taste fruity if the coffee is fruity, so that they taste floral if the coffee is floral, and so that it tastes nutty if the coffee is nutty. What you don't want is the coffees to taste like hay or green grass. That might be a sign of underdeveloped coffees. Or if it's more like malty, like roasted barley or cereal, it might be a sign of the coffees being too light. Also, you don't want the coffees to taste too ashy, which at least 10 years ago was more often the case than not. So even me 10 years ago was roasting very, very dark compared to what we do today. And that's just a matter of we weren't really brewing the coffee that well back then. So once we started to learn how to extract coffee well, we could extract more of the coffee. And then since the coffee was very dark then, we tasted more and more burnt flavors. So that meant we could go lighter and lighter in roast. So our espresso now is, lighter than our filter roast was 10 years ago, and our filter roast now is very, very different than it was 10 years ago. Okay, first question in, and please feel free to ask questions. I will try to answer them as much as I can, or refer to people, persons, or literature where you might find the answers. The first one here is from Vitor Costa. Hello, Tim. I would like to know your opinion about ending a roast before or right at the beginning of first crack. Is it possible to have a fully developed bean in any way? If not, could you explain why chemically? I'm not a chemist, but if you take the coffee out before first crack, the problem with that is that the cell structure of the beans will be very, very hard and tough. So it's, first of all, very difficult to grind the coffee. And second of all, difficult for the water to penetrate the cells anyway, and also to get those fatty acids that creates the coffee flavor out. Also, I think you're very, very early in the pyrolytic stage and Maillard reactions at the first crack, so you haven't really developed all those kind of flavors. So you tend to get a coffee that is very malty and not so nice. If it's a natural processed coffee, you might smell that the green beans have a very fruity smell. So you might get some fruity flavors in the coffee even before first crack. But I don't really recommend doing it before first crack because the coffee beans are just way too hard, and you're going to break not just your own grinder, but all your customers' grinders. The first crack is a reaction that occurs because there's a lot of water inside the beans. So when you heat up the beans, the cell walls are really, really hard, and the water expands and becomes steam and starts to create pressure. And when the pressure gets too high, the coffee beans crack, and that's the first crack. The second crack, for those of you who roast the second crack, which I used to do, 15 years ago, that's a reaction from the buildup of CO2 gases inside the bean. And already the beans are very brittle when this happens, so the crack is not so loud. But because of the Maillard reactions, you have a kind of a waste product from that reaction, that is CO2 gas. And then it just starts to build up more and more gas, so that the beans crack for a second time. So first crack is because of water, second crack is because of the CO2 gas. You might take the coffee out in the first crack. We do that. Even our espresso is still cracking first crack when we take it out. So it depends on your roast profile and your development time, what you want to do. But what's most important is that it tastes good. Roasting far after first crack, it's a matter of taste. I don't prefer it. I did, 10 years ago, not anymore. So, anymore, have you been using the roaster in profile mode, fully automatic? And what Michael Tyson is talking about here is my lowering roaster having the ability to roast on a programmed profile. And he's also asking, has it allowed you to break some of the rules that you may have in place for roasting on the Probat, such as charge, turn, and end temperatures? People say that lowering can make the coffees taste green. Why do you think this is? Have you experienced it? Okay, first of all, we haven't really played with the fully automatic profiling yet, but we're actually maybe planning on doing it on next week, because we're going to roast 12 bags of green coffee for a company who have imported their own coffee, and they just want it roasted to a certain degree, and we might try to use that profile for that coffee. If lowering makes the coffee taste green, that's a matter of the roast profile. In my opinion, our coffees tasted much greener when we were roasting on the Probat, and we actually, when we did the tests, the new roaster we have, we tested for about a month, and when we cupped those profiles, we tried to get it at least as good as on the Probat. But once we kind of had tasted a lot of cups from the lowering and then went back to the Probat, we could immediately taste a slightly green flavor, which meant our coffees were slightly underdeveloped. And that means they're a little bit green in the middle and roasty on the outside. And we hadn't really noticed that so much over the years. Of course, we got it every now and then, but you kind of get accustomed to this flavor. But it was very noticeable when we went from the lowering to the Probat. So I would actually say that it's easy to get the coffee to taste green on a lowering. It's also very easy to do it on a Probat. It's easy to do on a Dietrich. It's really easy to get the coffee to taste green if you roast very light. So it's more difficult to get them fully developed and get them to taste sweet and nice when you do the light roasts. I also have tasted a lot of dark roasts that also have green flavor. So it's not a matter of the roast degree, but how the profile is, like how much energy did you put in the beginning of the roast and towards the end. If you, for instance, have way too much energy on at the end, you might get a very roasty outer surface and a very green inner bean. But it's also a matter of how much energy you put in at the beginning of the roast. So every roaster is different. We kind of have to learn how to use it. But in my opinion, our coffees are more developed now, but they're also slightly lighter in color. So for us, it's at least easier to develop the coffees with the lowering than it was on the Probat. So whatever machine you have, you can roast the coffee well. It's just a matter of tweaking the machine, making sure you have the right probes, making sure you have the right profiles for the coffee that you're roasting. Airflow also. Okay, next question from Glenn Nicole. Hi, Tim. Would like to ask you, what would be the best pathway to become a working roaster, as it seems very tough to get a job as a roaster. If you don't have hands-on experience, thank you. Okay, so tough question. I actually weren't allowed to start roasting when I did. So I was working for a coffee chain called Stocklets in Norway, and they were owned by a roastery in the biggest specialty roastery in Norway called Solberg & Hansen. And I went there because I wanted to start roasting our espresso for the coffee bar chain, and they wouldn't allow me to touch the roasters. And then I kind of asked my friend Willy Hansen, who had taught me how to make espresso, and I was kind of frustrated, and he just took me to the sample or cupping room and showed me how the sample roaster works. So that's where I started to roast. I would say if your company is roasting, then just at least talk to your boss or whoever is in charge and let them know that you're interested in starting to roast. Maybe you should start reading about roasting. Maybe at least you can ask if you could do sample roasting, and that would be a good start, I think. However, roasting might sound very romantic, and it is if you have a small roaster, a small cafe, and you can kind of roast first and then taste the coffee afterwards. But roasting can be very, very different if you're working for a larger roaster, or for instance, for us, it's more of a production site. When we are roasting, we're just trying to produce the coffee we want, you know, in an efficient manner. And then we do the production cupping the week later, but it's kind of like working in a factory, actually. It's very noisy, it's very tough on your body. You know, you're standing up and down all day long, you're carrying a lot of stuff. We have girls doing it, guys, it doesn't really matter, but you kind of have to be a patient person and willing to work systematically and you know, stand next to the roaster and push buttons all day. That's what you do. So it's more of a production job than it is a romantic kind of a roaster job. So you have to maybe think about that. Maybe try it out before you kind of go down that path. But if you're interested, I would, and if you're not working for a company that's roasting, maybe you should start contacting companies who are, and just let them know that you're interested, so that when a position opens up, you might be asked. Hope that answers your question. So the next question, Stephanie Kui, I hope that I pronounced your name right. Are you waiting until all the pops of first crack end, then before drop, waiting to hit a target temperature, color, etc.? So on our loring, we are actually not able to hear the crack because the roaster is quite loud. So we don't even know when it starts to crack. And it always bothered me, because when you mark first crack on a roast profile, do you mark it when you hear the first bean cracks? What if you miss the first bean? Is when the crack starts to kind of roll? So we actually started just marking when the coffee came to a certain temperature, 200 degrees. We just decided that's the start of our first crack. And normally on most of our coffees, it's around that temperature. It's 199, 198, or 201 or 200. So after that, after you mark the first crack, you will have a development time until you drop the coffee out and cool it down. So that development time is anywhere, for us at least, anywhere from maybe 50 seconds to 1 minute 30 seconds, depending on the coffee and the profile, sometimes longer. But once we drop the coffee into the cooling tray, in most cases, you will still hear beans cracking. Theoretically, it would be ideal if all the beans cracked at the same time. So instead of hearing small firecrackers going off, you would hear like a big bomb. But every bean is different, and they absorb heat differently, not at the same time, because it's, you know, probably 1 million beans in one batch. So yeah, our quality control is weight loss and roast degree, so we measure color and ultimately the flavor. So we want to hit target temperature now with the loring. It's quite accurate, so when we drop on a certain temperature, we can expect a certain color. Whereas with our old probats, that was not always the case. But it really depends on your profile. So if the total profile is almost the same on the loring, and then the end temperature will give you you know, the roast degree we want. But we always measure the roast degree and aim for a very, very tight window. And if we're not within that window, we actually don't sell it as our branded coffee. We sell it for cost price, cheap in our store as a test roast. So I hope that answers your question. Hi from Hong Kong. Hello. So Herman Botta, yeah. Do you think there is a tendency in Scandinavia to underdevelop coffee, and that people think the lighter the roast, the better it should be, even if they don't like the taste? Herman, that's a good question. I think that's been a trend all over the world, actually. It was, at least in the US, maybe 1 or 2 years ago. It still is around here in Europe. I think people roast light because they like that flavor maybe from other roasters, but don't necessarily understand the coffee they're working with, or are able to taste or detect when the coffees are green. Maybe because all their coffees are green, or you know, it's tricky to do light roasts. I think it's very, very difficult. Even we struggle with it every week to get the coffees fully developed and still keep it as light as we want without having that kind of roasted bitter flavors that I personally dislike. So that's why I do it. But for me, at least, it's not a matter of going as light as possible, because if you want to do that, you just don't roast the coffee. But it's a matter of fully developing the coffee without having this kind of bitterness that I personally don't like. So, every roaster is different, and their personal preference is different. And some people even like the slightly underdeveloped flavor, where you have the kind of slightly green or slightly hay-like flavor. Some people don't mind that necessarily. But I would probably hope that most of the people who want the light roasts are after sweetness. And you don't get a lot of sweetness unless you develop the coffee well. So is it a trend in Scandinavia? Well, certainly here in Norway, I was just copying coffees from 7 different roasters today, and they were all tasting phenomenal. Well-developed, very light, very sweet, very bright and fragrant coffees. So for me, that's paradise. And that's the kind of coffees that I like. But there are also roasters who don't do it and prefer more developed coffees. There's nothing wrong in that. I think there's space for everyone in the market. And I know for a fact that not all my guests love the way we roast, so they might be buying coffees from other roasters who are roasting a little bit darker. So whatever you feel like. So Mohsen Sadri, I hope that's a good pronunciation. Hello, Tim, from Iran. Cool. If we see old school coffee roasting that used to roast dark, as I know in sensory experience about the dry distillation process, which made in dark roast coffee, and also the sugar browning, which in the middle one. So why we have nutty flavor still in dark roast coffees? Well, you can still roast dark coffees and underdevelop them. That means you will roast the outer surface very dark, and it'll still be slightly greenish inside. You can get these nutty flavors. Also, nutty flavors can come from the coffee itself. It might be a low-grown coffee that has nutty flavors. Very, very common in lower-grown coffees. For instance, in Brazil, but also in Colombia, in the lower altitude areas, also in Honduras, in the lower altitude areas. The coffees don't ripen for a very long time, so they do get a little bit of that nutty flavors. It can come from variety. Some cultivars are giving more nutty flavors than others. A Bourbon that is not grown in the highest altitude certainly is one. There can be hybrids that has been mixed with Robustas. In Arabicas in India can have these kind of nutty flavors if the altitude isn't too high, and so on. And it can also be Quakers. So if you're tasting a peanut flavor and you have a lot of these light, underdeveloped beans you see it in the roasted beans if the majority is darker in color, and then you have a couple of light ones. Very, very common in some Ethiopian coffees, in natural processed coffees, in Brazilian coffees, where the screen sizes are quite low. Sometimes you'll have Quakers, and if you just crack them open and smell the beans, they will smell like peanuts or popcorn. And so take those out, and then you'll get rid of the nutty flavors. It can also come from other things, but I can't list them all here. I hope that answers your question. Okay, Ryan Kaufman. Hi, team. Do you have any insight into whether there is a market for Nordic roasting in the US? It seems to be an uphill battle to try to change opinions about development and the necessity of roasted ashy flavors. Well, Ryan, I actually have a lot of American guests in my store at the moment, because we have cruise ships coming in with a lot of Americans on. And at least they seem to enjoy the coffees that we're serving. And so, yeah, I definitely think there's a market for it. We actually sell a lot of roasted coffee to the US through our web shop. So there are certainly people who like it. It hasn't been easy for us either. I've been working in coffee almost for 20 years now, and I had my company for 10 years, and it's been a gradual change towards the style that we do. But I would say after 2008, we have been pushing these lighter roasts, and not everyone loves it here either. So I think if you love it, then you should stick to your guns and continue serving it, and you will over time get the guests and coffee fans who love it. They will be loving your coffees, and the ones who don't will go elsewhere. I mean, you can't please everyone, so I would highly recommend trying to serve what you prefer and what you love, because that's what's going to be easy for you to sell. It's really, really difficult for me to sell dark roasted coffee because I don't like the flavor. Hello, Tim. Have you tried preheating the coffee before loading? No, I haven't. I know I went to a roastery in Netherlands who were actually pre-roasting the coffee. So they were pre-drying the coffee. Sorry, I just need some coffee. They were pre-drying the coffee in the roasting to where the beans become yellow, took it out, cooled it down. And they did this because they wanted to pre-blend the coffee and then kind of roast them more equally. Didn't love the results of that, but so that's why I don't do it. But preheating, no, I don't really do that. We actually did some tests recently because we have a cool storage where our green coffee is in our roastery. So I tested frozen beans, refrigerated beans, and room temperature beans, and then roasted it straight out of the freezer, straight out of the fridge, just from room temperature. We couldn't really notice a huge difference there in development. We had to adjust the roast profile slightly, but we got all of the coffees to taste really good, so it was inconclusive what was better. But what we do now in order to keep the consistency in our roast is to keep all our coffee in the cool room, because that's very, very stable in temperature. And then we take it straight out of there into the roaster so that we're more easily able to follow the profile. Because if the coffees were, 20 degrees one day and minus 20 degrees another day, when you start the roast, you'll have a very, very different start on the profile. Hope that answers your question. Fabian Kessler, hi Tim, how has the AeroPress brewing in the bar changed based on the new roaster and profiles? Did you have significant bumps in TDS, and how have you adjusted? Excellent question. Someone is ringing our doorbell. Well, Fabian, I actually did have noticed a change in TDS. So our coffees are a little bit more soluble now. That means we can grind a little bit coarser to get the same TDS. But our coffees also taste better on higher extraction, which probably means the coffees are a little bit more evenly roasted. So yeah, we have noticed, and we can actually go slightly lighter on our espresso in color and still have a lot of sweetness without having this sour acidity. And our espresso QC, before because we use master rollbar grinders, I normally said, our window of exceptions where our extraction should lie is between 19 and 20%. And normally it was 19.5 to 20. But now we're actually above 20, and it's still tasting really, really sweet without any bitterness. So yeah, I have noticed, and it'll be really interesting to see when we learn how to use our roaster a little bit more and kind of improve on our profiles, if we can extract even higher to maximize sweetness and flavor without having bitterness and so on. I would say our biggest challenge when we go lighter in our espresso roast is that a lot of our customers still are not so good at extracting espresso. It might be due to technical things or filters or knowledge. We're trying to teach them, but if you have dull burrs on your grinder, or the machine is not adjusted well, then you might be hitting 18% extraction, and with the light roast we do then, it just tastes really sour. So with the lighter roast you can up your extraction quite a lot and without having that bitter flavor. Hope that answers your question. Gareth Drews, hey Tim, thanks for sharing your thoughts. How does one ensure fully developing the coffee when roasting light? Obviously it's mostly in the profile, but can you provide insights that come to mind? Yes. So first of all, this really depends on the coffee, and I have to say that the way we roast now probably doesn't apply to everyone, and that's because most of the coffees we buy are dried really slowly in shade, and that means the beans have more intact cell structure, so they're harder, so they can take more heat. So for instance, if I roasted coffee from Finca Tamana that was dried in the hot dryer that he has for his commercial coffee, It takes 6 days to dry. The beans get a little puffy. The cell structure is broken. If I roasted that coffee in the same way I did the shade-dried one, that is dried for 20 to 30 days, where the beans are more dense, the results will be completely different. The quickly dried one will be extremely dark, and the shade-dried one will still maybe slightly underdeveloped if we use the same profile. So I would say we use a lot of energy, especially at the beginning. And with the loring, we're actually keeping that energy quite high until maybe mid-roast, so around 5-6 minutes. And then we gradually go down a little bit on the gas setting. And depending on the coffee, how much moisture and stuff, we'll either keep the heat quite high or lower it quite a lot at the end. So we find that, at least on the ProBat, we could lower the heat at the end when the coffees were higher in moisture. Whereas if the coffees were very dry, meaning low moisture content, below 10, we actually had to keep the heat on quite a lot at the end for some reason. In general, if you roast very slowly, it's going to be hard to do the light roasts. You need a lot of energy. So our roast times on the loring now, on the 30 kilo batch, is between 9 and 10.5 minutes. On the ProBat, it was between 9.5 and 11 minutes. So a little bit quicker on the loring, but it's a hot air roaster, so it's a little bit more efficient. Also, if you keep way too much energy at the end, you're just gonna get a roasty surface and green inner. So you kind of have to work around it a little bit on your roaster, but I would definitely not be afraid of roasting too fast. I think it's easier to develop the beans if you have a lot of energy. So you get it to crack a lot and so on. So try that. Also try adjusting your workflow, airflow. If your airflow is very weak, at least on my old ProBat setup, the coffees tended to taste very malty and green. That was just the way it was on my roaster. I know that Scott Rao is recommending very low airflow. And when I did that on my roaster, the drum would just warp and not go around anymore because it expanded too much. So it's a little different from setup to setup what you actually can do on your roaster. So play around with the airflow and also the times. Don't be afraid of doing 8-minute roasts depending on the batch size and so on. Christian, I'm not going to even try to pronounce that, but there's an I in there, which is cool. Hi Tim, do you approach roasting the same way on the loring as you did on the ProBat? Low heat in the beginning, max heat after approx 1 minute, and then slowly lowering the heat towards the first crack. Development time around 1 minute, same total roast time. No, I think I just kind of answered that as well, Christian, but with the loring, we're definitely on with the heat a little bit quicker, and that's just because there's no hot drum heating up the beans. So we kind of have to go in a little bit quicker with the full heat. And you would probably see on our, we actually use the automatic charge function. We find that to be, because we are 2-3 people roasting, instead of trying to hit the target by pushing a button manually, we'll just let the roaster do it. And then we also set the gas setting we want on the loring automatically at the beginning. And I think that kicks in around 20 minutes after your charge. And that's basically because it takes a little while for the beans to come into the roaster and the bean hopper hatch to lock. So normally around 20 seconds. It might also be 30 to 40 seconds before we go full heats. And full heat depending on batch size, what percent that is. But what we do on the loring more so than the ProBat is that we are lowering a lot more towards the end, and that's just because the hot air seems to be a lot more efficient than all the conduction or convection. I can't remember the metal drum heating up the beans. Hope that answers your question. The roast times tend to be about a minute quicker, maybe slightly more depending on the coffee. But we're doing 30 kilo batches and not 12 kilo, so it's a little different. Development times a little bit the same, a little bit quicker on the loring, I think. Antonio Lopez, hi Tim, how is the turning point related to the taste of coffee? Antonio, I don't know. Really don't know. We haven't really been researching that a lot. I think you should check out the book that Rob Hoos wrote, Modulating the Flavor of Coffee or something. He is also very experienced on the loring, so he's the one to ask about this. We're kind of not looking that much on the turning point. We're looking more on the total profile, charge temperature relating to how much coffee you put in, and so on. I do want to play a little bit around with the charge temperature because it doesn't seem to have a lot of impacts, at least on the loring. But we'll see. We have to test a little bit. Okay, Jonas Schlepfer, something like that. Hi, Tim. A question regarding the rate of rise curve. Most of the roast curves I've seen so far do have a falling rate of rise throughout the roast. However, recently I've seen some curves where towards the end the rate of rise goes up for a short period of time and continues to decline until the end of the roast. Why does that work and taste good? I haven't found any literature on that approach. So, yeah. So, Jonas, the rate of rise curve or any curve that you see really depends. How it looks really depends on your roaster, the probe, what type of probe it is, how thick or thin it is, how quick it is, where it's placed in the roaster. It depends on so many different things. On loring, we can kind of start to discuss different curves because it's kind of the same setup on, at least the new lorings, it's more or less the same setup from roaster to roaster because it's a closed system. But with the probats, there's so many other things affecting what the temperature probe is measuring. So you can't really compare curves or rate of rise curves roaster to roaster. The rate of rise curves tend to decline just because the coffee absorbs more heat in the beginning, I guess. So what you're describing is that you might see the rate of rise curve slightly declining and then it goes up a little bit and then down again. And where it goes up a little bit and down again, at least at the end, is normally the first crack. That's where the beans goes from exothermic, so heat's only hitting the beans from the outside. Because of the crack, there's a lot of energy, so the bean is also heating itself from the inside and out. So it's getting heat from the inside and out and outside and in. And then you'll see the temperature rising a little faster. So what a lot of roasters like to do is to lower the heat slightly before first crack or right when they see that start to happen so that they kind of even out that rate of rise curve. That didn't really work so well on my old Probat, but we have to do it on our loring, at least on some of the coffees. Otherwise, we do tend to get a slightly underdeveloped coffee. So you can experiment a little bit with your roaster, whether it's better to smooth it out or to have that bump still, depending also on the moisture content on the coffee, in my experience, especially on the drum roaster. So, Wilson Wong. Hi, Tim. Usually, how do you determine the total roast time? Well, it depends a little bit on my experience when I taste the coffee. So if, for instance, the coffee, like our Kenyan coffee, was tasting a little astringent, and also our Colombian coffee was tasting a little astringent, that means it dries out the mouth. Astringent is kind of like when, if you brew Assam tea from India and you just over-extract it, you just leave the tea bag in the teacup for too long, and then drink it, you get a very astringent flavor. So to get rid of that, we extended our roast time a little bit and still had the same roast color. And then the astringency got away. And I think it was just we were roasting too fast. So you do get a little burnt outside and maybe slightly green inside or something like that. So we just, when we get a new coffee, we test. And normally, my Kenyan coffees tend to be roasted a little bit faster. They're quite big and dense beans, so we use a lot of energy to develop them. Whereas other coffees like Finca Tamana, which is also quite dense and hard beans, we tend to need to stretch that out a little bit. don't really know the theory behind it. Someone can help me maybe, but so we actually just experiment a little bit when we get a coffee with a little bit different times, a little bit different profiles, and then choose whatever works. That's how we work here. We go by trial and error. Chong Kai Cheng. What's next step for Nordic trend? Will it spread into some new area like St. Petersburg, which is near Northern Europe? Any recommendation for good coffee shop there? I haven't been to St. Petersburg in many years, so I am not the one to ask. I would say that Double B is a chain in Russia that is opening a lot of stores, and I think they're roasting quite light. So, I think you will see some Nordic style coffee, whatever that means, because you have both very dark and very light roasted coffee in Nordic countries. But what you probably refer to is the lighter ones. You'll probably see them opening all over the world, but also other styles of coffee shops opening. So I don't really know what the trend is. If I knew, then I would be a rich man. How would you roast coffee that you had previously roasted before? Oh, not previously roasted before. Sorry, Glenn. I thought you were asking, how would you roast a coffee that you had previously roasted before? So double roasts. I wouldn't. So a coffee that I had not roasted before, well, first of all, then I would probably do some sample roasts. Just try a little bit different things to see what the potential in that coffee is. See how it kind of acts in a sample roast. And then based on that knowledge, I would go on a bigger roaster and do some tests. But, I would check how the density of the beans is. Is it a very heavy coffee or a light coffee? And you do that, filling the coffee in a liter measurements or something. See how much it weighs compared to a Kenyan AA or something. And then moisture content, of course. And then, just go from there. And based on experience, you would kind of know what to do a little bit. But I haven't really been roasting that much low density coffees on the Loring, so can't really give you some insight there. I do know that with our Brazils, we tended to go slightly lower on airflow, especially on the lower screen size, and then quite a lot hot drum temperature in the beginning. Cobus Erasmus. Hi, Tim. Hello from South Africa. Cool. You say you mark first crack at around 200. No, we do at 200, not around, on the Loring. So if we did that on our Probat or old Probat, the coffee would be charcoal because we were, taking the coffee out on 160 degrees on the probe temperature on our old Probat. On our Loring, the bean temperature, 200 when we mark the first crack. What is your temperatures when you drop between 50 seconds and 130 then? All right. From memory, let's see. I have a document here that I can just check. Here, so I'll tell you. Let me just open the documents. Excel. So our current recipes say that, why doesn't Excel want to open? My video is probably using too much. Here it is. So on our, let's say our Kenyan coffee, we dump it at 205.6 degrees at the moment. It's a pea berry. The total time is 9 minutes 34. Our geisha, 206.2 degrees. Our coffee from Finca Tamana, 206.7 degrees. Our espresso from Finca Tamana, 206.6 degrees. So it's actually a little bit lower, but a little bit longer development time. And our espresso from Honduras, 209 degrees. So different degrees for different coffees, but that's the range. So it means at the end of the roast, the bean curve is not rising a lot. Hope that answers your question. Ryan Kaufman, not a question, just wanted to say that the SL28 from Finca Tamana is phenomenal. One of the best I've ever had. Wow, thank you, Ryan. That's great to hear. This is actually the second kind of harvest we get from him, although it's the third picking. The first one was very, very small quantities. So this was harvested in November, and it wasn't a lot of coffee, just a couple of 100 kilos. And we had to mix everything together in order to get it milled. So it was mixed from, early November, late November, December, and so on. But it still tasted pretty good. And hopefully now he's harvesting now. So hopefully we'll get a lot more of it coming in at towards the end of the year. I also really like it. It's really full-bodied, very fruity, but not too acidic like the Kenyans can be. So you get that kind of really warm, blackcurrant flavor and so on. We're going to serve it tomorrow at our AeroPress competition here. So if you're in Norway, come to our AeroPress happening tomorrow. You can taste that. Also, we'll be serving it in our espresso bar tomorrow. All right, 40 minutes. Time flies. But we can do some more questions, I think, since we are here. Hi, team. I wonder what's the advantage of your new roaster comparing to others like Probat? Very good question, and very easy to answer. Our old Probat was a very, very old designed drum roaster. And I have to just say that the new Probats are not the same as the old Probats that I used to work on. So the drum roaster we had was drawing a lot of air from the room into the roaster through the drum and out the chimney. So we would heat that air, let it through the coffee and out the chimney. So the first advantage that the Loring is, it's a closed system. So it recycles the air that goes through the coffee. That means when we heat up the air, it goes through the drum of the roaster, out of the drum again, into the cyclone. We burn up all the smoke, and the chaff gets collected in the chaff bucket, and then the air enters the drum again. So that means we're recycling both the heat and the air that's inside the roaster. It also burns up all the smoke, so there's no smoke coming out of the roaster, which means we don't need a chimney. Better for the local environment. We use less gas because we can recycle the heat, so it's more economic. And because it's a closed system, it doesn't really matter what temperature it is in the room that we're roasting in. It's much, much easier to follow the profiles from day to day. Whereas with the Probat we had, if we had a cold day or a hot day, it was very difficult to follow the same profile because the roaster was drawing so much air from the room through the drum. So that's the major difference. Another difference is that the Loring is the flame is not underneath the drum, so it's in the cyclone. So it actually heats up air and transports the air through the drum. So there's no conductive heat, so the drum is not hot. Whereas with the Probat, the flames were underneath the drum, heating up the drum, and you had like a combination of conductive and convection heat. I hope I get these terms right. I can't remember. It's a little late today. So it's two very, very different systems, and I'd like to kind of compare them to, at least my old Probat was kind of like steering an old steam locomotive, whereas our Loring is more like a electric top modern train. The new Probats, I don't really have that much experience with them. So, but I hear that they also have removed the flame from underneath the drum, but I'm not sure. So I better check that out during the show in Amsterdam. Okay, Hauke Meyer. Hi Tim, what would you contribute a dry, flat aftertaste to? What part of the roasting would you blame for that? Flat, dry aftertaste can be two things. Over-roasted coffee, dark flavors or roasty flavors are normally dry and flat. Or baked coffee, which means you haven't given the coffee enough energy. Maybe your roast times are way too long. Maybe you are stalling the roast by not having enough flame and so on. So that could be the issue. Can also be your green coffee getting old. Crisis, it'll taste like wood. So get rid of that. But try to speed up your roast and try to roast it lighter maybe. Maybe you'll get rid of it. I don't know. A couple more questions. From Sylvia, when you did your research to buy new equipment, which advantage you saw in the lowering machine? What are your thoughts about Dietrich? Sylvia, for me, it was kind of easy. I wanted both the roaster to be more efficient, so less impact on the environment. I also wanted it to be able to replicate the profiles more easily, and easy to clean, easy to use. And from my experience, the lowering was the best one when we decided 2 years ago. Dietrich didn't really have the size we wanted back then. Now they do. But I'm pretty sure if I did the research again, I would end up buying a lowering. It's just, I really like the way the coffees taste when I roast on it. I think they are well developed with very light roasts, and it's also really, really easy to work on, easy to clean. It's not the most sexy roaster to have in a store, and it's very noisy. So it really depends on your environment and so on. But I would highly recommend, if you have the chance and want to buy a roaster, to test them and research. And it's also important to have good support in your country. It's probably going to be one of the most expensive investments you do. And it's better to spend a little bit of time and coffee on researching what roaster you like, rather than just buying the one you like because of design or whatever, and you end up not liking the roaster. I also always recommend people to buy a little bit bigger the roaster than they think they need, because you're quickly gonna grow it out of it, most likely. Whew, a lot of questions. Maybe we have to do another session. Can continue a little bit more. Andrei Novoseolov. Hello, Andrei. Hi, Tim. A few months ago, I was at the courses about coffee roasting, and there was said that the roasting process divides to 3 parts: drying, caramelization, development, and the average time of the part should be equal 3 to 5 minutes for first, 3 to 5 for second, and 1 to 2 minutes for third. Time depends on batch size. What do you think about this, and how do you build your roasting profile? Thanks in advance. Yeah, it sounds not so far off from what I see. You know, drying stage being from, I mean, this is all just a matter of definition, but you can also probably research it and come to a conclusion when Maillard reactions happens and so on. Drying stage being when the coffee goes from green to yellow. You know, most of the stuff happening then is just water being heated up and steam coming out of the bean and so on. But the drying stage is actually happening all the way towards first crack, because we know that because the steam is creating pressure and the bean cracks. So probably it's not like first stage it's only drying, and the second stage is only, you know, it's probably happening all along. Second stage, Maillard reactions. I think Rob Hughes came up with or I don't know if he came up with it, but he's actually talking about it. Morten Munchau is also talking about it a lot. But at least when the beans are starting to, you can smell these kind of bready smells, and the beans are turning browner. We know that Maillard reactions are happening, and that's normally when at temperatures above 150 degrees, because before that, no Maillard reactions. So, and then the last development time is also a matter of just a definition, because the coffee is developing all the time. But we call it development time, and the times you're talking about sounds about right, I think, depending on batch size and roaster and your preference. You know, in the old days, when I started roasting, my total roast time was 19 minutes. I roasted my espresso just to when second crack happened and I took the coffee out. So then drying times were much longer, development times were much longer, and so on. Imagine that. And still it was considered to be light. So Fabian, what's the water specs in terms of minerals in your water used in the roaster for cupping? What's the TDS, general hardness, carbon hardness, blah, blah, blah. Magnesium, calcium, still looking for the perfect water to brew your coffees. Maybe put this up on the website to have it handy for your customers. Yeah, I could put it up on our website, probably. That's a good thing. I'll get it reanalyzed because it's changing a little bit from winter to summer. But in general, the water in Oslo is very, very soft. Normally, when you just use a TDS meter, it'll say 50 to 100 TDS. Think 2.5 degree hardness Can't remember the specs. pH somewhere between 7 and 8. Yeah, but I'll have to retest it if I want to publish it online, and probably retest it every now and then to update it. But you know, in my experience, soft waters work. I've used RO water in Denmark that is very, very soft, you know, 50 parts per million. It still tastes really nice. Of course, the bicarbonates can neutralize the acidity a little bit, even if the water is very soft, but I prefer softer to harder. So keep it below 100 TDS if you use a TDS meter, and you'll most likely be happy. And if you're not happy with the coffee, it might be the brewing as well. You know, it should be quite bright, but also sweet. Try to extract more. That's probably not a problem if you do. Tolga Daglum. Hi, you measured the pressure of the exhaust air at your probat? No. What you changed the setting in relation to the weather season and after cleaning the chimney? Okay, Tolga, so we actually had a variable frequency drive, which we could adjust the speed of the fan. So that's how we determined the airflow. We didn't really measure the pressure of it. We tended to go lower on the airflow in the winter and slightly higher in the summer. Yeah, because it's colder in the winter and hotter in the summer. Sherman, hey Tim, what Agtron color of the ground beans would you consider underdeveloped? Also, what is the normal difference between the whole bean color and the ground bean color? Sherman, don't really remember the Agtron scale. It's been, you know, since 2003 since I used an Agtron. We use a color track, and that has a different scale. So I can't really answer that question. But you can have extremely dark coffees that still are underdeveloped. You can also have very light coffees that are underdeveloped, and medium roast color that is underdeveloped. But what's considered too light, maybe, that's a different thing. I don't really remember the actual scale for that. I'm really sorry. Just taste, and then you will see. Who are the roasters that you enjoy, Glenn? Oh, many roasters. Used to be very few. Probably my favorite roaster in the world is Coffee Collective. And not just because their coffees are phenomenal, but I think the way they source and buy and have focus on paying the farmers well, full transparency, sourcing as directly as they can. They roast the coffees really well. They commit to coffees. They buy coffees from the same farmer every year, even though the harvest is going up and down. That's a lot more important to me than the actual bag of coffee tasting phenomenal. Anyone can buy a geisha on an auction and have a fantastic coffee, but being consistent over time with all their coffees, Coffee Collective is my number one. I recently enjoyed a really good coffee from Geisha Village, roasted by April in Copenhagen. I really enjoy coffees. I enjoy Christian, that used to work at Damateo. He's now opened his own roastery. I love his roast style. Solberg and Hansen can have fantastic microlots. Lippe in Norway, Supreme Roastworks in Norway. Who else? There's too many. Yeah, so that's from top of my head, the ones that I've tasted recently. That was good. Had phenomenal coffee in Bucharest in Romania. So, you know, good coffee is everywhere. 53 minutes. Let's stop it at 1 hour. Right, Corey?
Yeah.
Good thing that I was actually able to read the questions today. Okay, Michael Tyson. Where in the roast does sweetness come from? If I have roasted an Ethiopian coffee that tastes beautiful, clean and tea-like, but lacks a bit of sweetness, where would that be in the roast? So Michael, that sounds like you might be roasting the coffee either a little too light or it's slightly underdeveloped, because you can still have these beautiful floral tea-like flavors without sweetness if you underdevelop the coffee. And especially with Ethiopian, because underdeveloped coffees normally have a sour acidity like citrus, and that kind of fits or kind of suits the coffee very well because it has a lot of citric flavors after all. So we actually noticed when we roasted our Hemkute, we tended to get a little bit more of that kind of lemon flavor on the Probat and more peach flavor on the Loring. But we found that it was probably because it was slightly underdeveloped on our old Probat roaster. That's just, you know, it's our fault, not the roaster's fault. It's our fault. So I would try to maybe speed up the roast a little bit. You don't have to necessarily roast it darker, but maybe speed it up. A little bit more energy at the beginning, maybe. And then see if that helps. All right. Someone still waiting for my June 1st bag subscription, Coffee Euro. Wow, 15 days. Well, Pong, we didn't actually send it out on June 1st, or if it was subscription you sent? Yes. So, Pong, just to clarify, we actually send the coffee out the first Wednesday of the month. So that means we sent it out last Wednesday, which was the 6th. And that's 9 days ago. So it should be right around the corner, hopefully. If it's not, please contact us on email. I'm really sorry that we can't track the subscription packages because we want to keep the costs down. But contact us if it's not there on Monday. I will try to help you out. And then Yves Laurent, I hope that's the way you pronounce the name. Hi Tim, how do you fix the parameter when the bean weigh less percent, always low than 12%? So even though thinking it's still just well, if the weight loss is 12%, that sounds okay for me. Depends on the coffee and the profile, but you have to remember that not every bean has the same moisture content. So if you have very high moisture content in your green beans, of course the weight loss will be higher than if you have low moisture content. So the weight loss really depends on the coffee and the roaster. We tend to find that the weight loss is a little bit higher on our Loring, even if the coffee is lighter. That probably means it's a little bit more developed, but it's also probably because the airflow is stronger. It's a hot air roaster, so it's more efficient on drying the coffee. So it's really difficult to tell you what the weight loss should be because it's a matter of the coffee and the profile and the taste you want. And if you want it higher, well, you probably have to roast it a little bit longer. If you want it lower, I'm not sure I would want it so much lower. Well, you can experiment. Sylvia, and I think this will be the last one because we're on 58 minutes. So the last question from Sylvia Blate. Tim, expect great green beans from Brazil. This heat... Okay, cool. I did get this year the weather is perfect. Perfect, Sylvia. I actually just got a sample on my desk a couple of days ago, so I'm really looking forward to tasting that. I really like Brazilian coffees, I have to say. There's some spectacular coffees in Brazil, especially in the eastern zone of Espírito Santo. The reason why I'm not buying it is because I just didn't sell a lot of it. And I like to work with farmers directly, helping them improve the quality, and spending a lot of time doing that just to buy 30 bags didn't really make sense. So I'll probably go back in the future. But for now, I'm focusing on the countries that we are working in already, which is El Salvador, Honduras, and Colombia, Ethiopia, and Kenya. And we kind of want to grow the volumes there first, and especially in Ethiopia, find some more projects, or find a project and a farmer to work with directly. So before we have found that, I'll have to put Brazil on hold, but I still enjoy cupping the coffees. And oh my God, there's some great coffees in Brazil. There's also tons of very average coffees. So I just have to look for them. Well, that's it for today, I think. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. And we'll probably do this again. with another subject, probably another roasting one, maybe in 6 months when we have worked a little bit more on the lowering. And until then, thanks for tuning in and hope to see you soon. Bye. And